Sponsored by newspapers.com, the largest online newspaper archive. Newspapers.com makes it easy to find your family's story with more than 500 million digitized newspaper pages from the 1690s to today. Search for obituaries, marriage and birth announcements, photos, and more in papers from across the U.S., the U.K., Canada, and beyond, stretching back 3 centuries. For listeners of this podcast, newspapers.com is offering 20% off a Publisher Extra subscription. Just use the code Genealogy Adventure at checkout. That code is Genealogy Adventure for 20% off Publisher Extra.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Genealogy Adventures. I'm Brian Sheffy.
And I'm Danya Williams. How are you guys today?
Hope you all are having a wonderful Sunday. As always, thank you for spending the next hour with us. And I hope the weather where you are is as gorgeous as it is in the DMV area.
Man, what? It is so beautiful out here right now. So it's just a beautiful, perfect day. But I want to jump right into this one because this is just a very interesting show, something that you and I are kind of close with because of the research that we do. So I want to introduce to you guys Miss Julie Zomer Weil. I hope I pronounced that right. Julie has been a reporter at the Washington Post since 2013, including 4 years covering religion in America. She currently covers DC local government, in addition to work on slavery and American history. So welcome to the show, Julie.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes. So, guys, Julie has a slight lag. So don't think she's not hearing it, but it's just a very slight lag.
Yes, technology 2022, that's all I've got.
Right.
So again, Julie, thank you so much. Donnie and I were just really excited to find out about the Washington Post project, because this is a database that is hosted by the Washington Post. And I know that the genesis for this project came in 2020, this database of congressmen who were enslavers. And I'm just really curious, whose kind of brainchild was this, and how did the project actually come together?
Well, thank you. I'm sorry for the apparent delay. It seems like I might be hearing what you say a minute after you say it, but I'll try my best. And I hope it's not too frustrating for anybody. How the project got started was, like you said, it was in the summer of 2020 when across America there were protests, including here in DC, for racial justice. And one of the many things that happened that summer and fall was that DC, like a lot of other cities, came up with a list of public buildings that local leaders said should be renamed. And I write about DC's local politics, as you mentioned. So when the mayor makes a list and says, these are the buildings we should rename, which, by the way, they ended up, almost none of them got renamed. And I've written about why that didn't happen. But I looked at that list in the fall of 2020, and I was writing about who these people were. And some of them were members of Congress. And I was trying to figure out why they were on this list, because the city didn't say, they just listed the names that were on the buildings. So I typed into Google members of Congress who were slave owners, thinking that that was why many of the people were on the list. And I thought that the list would come right up. There would be a long list of slave owners in Congress. And I'm clicking to the second page of Google and the third page, and it's not there. And basically that day, as soon as I knew there was no list of every slave owner in Congress, I knew that I needed to make one. So fast forward a couple years, that's what we have, a Washington Post database of more than 1,800 slave owners who were elected to Congress.
And is there any
Wow.
indication that that number of congressmen is growing?
Yes. So the total universe of congressmen who were in Congress before 1840, or not in Congress, who were born before 1840. Some of them were in Congress much later. The total number is more than 5,500 congressmen. And I was able to demonstrate pretty conclusively that more than 3,000 of them were never slave owners. I now have 1,800 who I know were slave owners, and that leaves more than 500 who I'm still researching. So I know we're talking today with a lot of people who are genealogists themselves or researchers or historians. I have a list published on the Washington Post website of those 500 or so congressmen who I don't know whether they were slave owners or not. And if you can help me reach a conclusion one way or another on those 500 men, I would really appreciate it. We will add research to the database. We will credit you by name. You can look on the database and you can see a list of amazing researchers. Dozens of people around the country have already helped me get to where I am right now.
Well, that is
Wow.
excellent. Because if anything, genealogists and researchers who are interested in genealogy, it's a very active community. And a lot of times, we're thankful because a lot of times you will get angels or just people who are interested in the topic and just welcome the opportunity to do new research. And I just wanted to remind the audience, this was not just a Southern thing. All 13 original colonies, and I know this was before the foundation of the Republic, but all 13 colonies had enslaved people. Slavery was practiced throughout the colonies. And I believe it was even still being practiced in the North, in the Atlantic state, even in the early years of the Republic. So are you finding that in the research that you're doing?
Yes, I found congressmen who were slave owners who represented 38 states at this point. That is every state in New England. It is certainly much, much more prevalent in the Southern congressmen, but congressmen all over the country were slave owners at some point in their lives.
Okay, does that also include places like California?
Yes, so in some of the Western states, occasionally you do find a congressman who actually perhaps came from a Southern state and brought enslaved people with him when he moved out west. But more often, those Southern congressmen uh, moved to eventually they represent Western states, but they're not necessarily slave owners when they're out there in the West.
Okay, so this really does cover the entirety of the country. Because again, as you were pointing out, people, enslavers were moving to different parts of the state. So again, even the slaveholding states in the Midwest were returning congressmen who were enslavers. So I'm really curious in this story, in the really early kind of decades of the Congress, is there a rough percentage? And I know the research is still ongoing, but is there a rough idea of what percentage of congressmen were actually enslavers?
I think we lost her. Hold on. Hey, Julie.
Hi, Julie.
Hi, can you see me, hear me?
Yes,
Yes,
yes. I think you
I'm
missed my
sorry, I
last.
got kicked out of the platform.
Oh,
you
okay.
did.
How rude. Well, very happy to have you back. And no doubt you missed my last question. I was saying in the early decades of the Congress, and I know that this research is still ongoing, is what percentage of congressmen were actually enslavers?
Those first 20 to 30 years that Congress exists, the percentage is exceptionally high. It's above half of the members of Congress who are current or former slaveholders at that point. It goes down over time, especially as slavery becomes less common in the North. But yeah, all the first laws that were written for the first decades of Congress were written by people who more than half of them were slaveholders.
Mm.
Mhm.
I mean, it
And
doesn't sound shocking to us because of the type of research that we've done and what we found for ourselves. Like you may want to really talk with us because we have a lot of people, and we'll take a look at your list and definitely see what if we can offer anything.
And again, for the benefit of the audience, we're just talking about
Thank you.
one branch of the U.S. government. So as there were also enslavers who were on the Supreme Court. There were also enslavers who were presidents. I mean, probably very familiar about who they were. So, I mean, really across the three levers of government, the viewpoint of slavery, would you say it's pretty fair to say was just entrenched? I mean, it really was hardwired into the country's DNA.
Oh, absolutely. And some of these communities were sending slave owners to Congress even at a point that there were not that many slave owners. If you look at the state of Delaware, there by 1860 there were very, very few slaveholders left in Delaware, and two of them were the state's two senators. The people who were the very wealthy families that were owning slaves were also sending people to Congress. This was very, very interesting with the people who were in power.
Mm-hmm. And the other question that I had for you was, because again, for the benefit of researchers, what types of research materials were you accessing, were you using, and kind of what places were you finding them in?
Did she get kicked out again?
That's a great question for this group. And I think this group will not. Can you hear me?
Yes,
yeah, now
yes,
we
we can hear you.
Okay, good. I've never used this StreamYard platform. It seems to have a lot more trouble than Zoom. Anyway, your question was a very good question about what resources I used. And for the vast majority of these congressmen I researched, I found the answers in census records, which I think will not surprise the researchers here. So I would read about congressmen and figure out where he lived at a particular time. Once I knew he was in this county in 1830, I could go to the census and look for him and see if he was a slaveholder or not in that census. So that accounted for most of my research. There's all sorts of other types of materials, though. Wills and tax records.
I think we've lost her again.
I don't know why it keeps kicking her out. This is crazy. This is crazy. I'm sorry,
So,
guys. It must be. I don't know. Here she is. Remove that one. Okay, I think we got you back. Can you hear us?
I'm just sitting here talking to you, and the program keeps kicking me out.
Oh, I'm so sorry. This is the first time this has ever happened. So
yeah, and
we will definitely.
this is our virtual studio space. So you were talking about the different kinds of records that you were accessing. So census records were a big part of that. And I can imagine the 1850, 1860 slave schedules would have also been important. And I think you were just beginning to touch on probate records.
Right.
Yes, many of the records that readers have sent me once I published the original form of the database and asked for more information from readers, like our listeners today, a lot of what was sent to me was wills and probate records.
Cool. And it's not going to be surprising for you. It's definitely not surprising for our audience. I guess the other reason why Donnie and I were so interested in the database itself and the project is we are both, as many of our cousins are, either directly descended from men who served in either the House of Representatives or the Senate, or they were family relations. And it's been a journey for us to kind of wrap our heads around the fact that for me in particular, being, a Braxton and a Claiborne, having family members who wrote, in support of the bill, and signed the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, they were enslavers. And again, that's just such a mind boggle to kind of get your head around. And I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. When we were in the green room, I mentioned that Donia was her uncle, her great uncle was Preston Brooks of South Carolina. So he was up here in DC. And I've got a couple. And I actually found them on the database, which was awesome in a way. Given the subject matter, it's upsetting, but the fact that they were there. Daniel Henry Sheffey, who represented Staunton from Virginia, he's my fourth great uncle. He was a first generation German American. And the interesting thing for him was, as a lawyer, he was helping enslaved people get their freedom, but he did not free his own enslaved people. Again, he was up in Washington, D.C. There's my 4 times great-grandfather, William Henry Roane, grandson of Patrick Henry. He was both a Virginia assemblyman, but he also served in the U.S. Congress. He introduced 2 bills in the really early part of the 1830s in Virginia to gradually phase out slavery. But he did not free his enslaved people, and he even managed to have 5, possibly 6 enslaved children with my 4 times great-grandmother, Eliza Christian. And to read, to be able to actually read the bills that he introduced onto the Virginia floor was quite interesting. There was a catch. He wanted to gradually phase out slavery. I like to think he had his 5 to 6 kids in his mind as he was doing that. But here was the kicker. If Virginia had passed that law, every single Black person, be it free people of color or enslaved people, would have had to leave Virginia because he just felt that the disparity of numbers between whites and Blacks was too great. And if you remember 1830s, that's right after the Nat Turner Revolt. So I guess he's thinking, well, if I can at least free my kids and get them out of the state, at least they'll be okay. So we kind of, we really do have a personal connection to this. And I think, Dawn, you wanted to talk a little bit about Preston Brooks.
Well, not just Preston. I also have, Andrew Butler, who was also was Preston's uncle. But my question to you is, does your database dig into the local places that that the local areas that may have had representatives? Because, for example, William Yeldell was actually a local representative for South Carolina, and he owned slaves. So I'm wondering, how deep can this go?
So right now, my database just includes members of Congress from the first Congress in 1789 onward. It doesn't go beyond that. But what I'm hoping, I'm in conversation right now with people at enslaved.org, a resource that I'm sure you've connected with, about connecting my database to their far, far larger database and being able to make those connections between the people in my database and, ideally the people they enslave. So people like Brian, this incredible amount about your family history and who your family does descend from and the hypocrisy of these people in your family history. A lot of people don't know that, and it's sometimes very hard to make those connections. And I hope that connecting my congressman to the enslaved.org database will someday make that a little bit easier.
Mm-hmm. So I guess broadly speaking, what kind of information can people find?
It kicked her out. I knew it was going to.
Okay, well, we're gonna have to raise this issue with the studio, and we apologize to our audience. We are having technical gremlins today. But while we are waiting for Julie to come back, if you'd like to start posting, actually, I see we do have some questions. But if you'd like to start posting more of your questions, this would be a great time.
Yeah. So I'm gonna suggest to her to go. Hey, Julie.
Hey, can you see me again?
Yeah. Do you want to try back your laptop real quick?
I just
And
turned
even if your picture doesn't come, huh?
I just turned off my Wi-Fi in case that's somehow the problem.
Okay. All right.
So if it kicks me
Well,
out, if it kicks me out again, then I will switch back to the laptop. How's that?
Oh, that's fine.
well, I think Georgiana Aiken has probably hit the nail on the head. She wrote, maybe they don't want us to have this information.
Exactly.
um, so Lacrissa Sims has asked a question, and I'm assuming she's speaking about the congressman in your date, congressmen in general. How many wanted to do away with slavery but kept their slaves for political reasons?
I mean, it's a great question, and I'm not sure that the data tells you what their reasons are. It just tells you yes or no. But from what I've seen, I was surprised how until the very, very last decades of the time period I was looking at, slavery and slaveholding were not a political liability. People were not running for Congress and having their opponents say, oh, he's a slaveholder, don't vote for him. It started happening as the Republican Party starts forming in the 1850s. But for most of American history, being a slaveholder at home was just sort of expected of many of these wealthy men. It wasn't something they were being politically challenged about.
And I guess to part, well, I don't have an answer for Georgianne, but I will say from my own experience, Patrick Henry, great grandfather, he wrestled with whether he was going to free his enslaved people at death for the latter part of his year. And remember, this is a man who was besties with George and Martha Washington. They were legit, really good friends. Martha and George, they freed their enslaved people. In the end, Patrick didn't. When it comes to William Henry Roane, no idea. He, unfortunately, he didn't commit anything to paper. So we don't, I have no information from them in terms of their own words, but I thought it was a really, really good question.
Well, I can answer it. Preston Brooks, he did not want to free anybody. Neither did Butler. They fought very much against it, and those happen to be the two people that I am directly connected
Mhm.
to. And they Preston, good Lord, he he did not he did not hold back. There are papers written where he actually states to step on the Constitution, and he tells you he has been a disunionist since the day he was born, and he will be
Mhm.
one until he dies. Like these are actual speeches that I found from him. So Preston wasn't trying to
Yeah.
free anybody.
Well, and again, thinking about it, just in this gross, simplest terms, for a lot of families like these, this was the greatest part of their wealth. Depending on how many enslaved people you had, they were worth more collectively than the land that they worked. Um, so there was obviously a financial consideration there as well. So Julie, given the amount of work that has gone into your database, and the information that's there, and I'm going to cycle back to that in a minute. I'd like to talk about what people can actually learn, what information is contained in the database. Well, actually, why don't we start there? So someone goes to the database, they do a search. Are they going to get a list of the names of the enslaved people, or kind of what information is available about the congressman?
I hope she's there. It looks like she's frozen. Yep, she's frozen.
Never had this issue before.
Never had it. I'm so sorry, guys. Hi, Julie.
Hi again. I'm on the laptop now.
Yeah, well, this is fine. We know what you look like.
That's okay. So I have a question about the information that's actually contained on the database itself. So say an audience member or anyone else just goes to the website, does a search. What information are they going to pull up about that congressman? Are they going to get names of the enslaved people, or what kind of information is there?
No, unfortunately not. And that's one of the reasons that I really hope this partnership with enslaved.org comes to be, because that would help connect the names of the congressmen to the names of the people they enslaved when we know that, which so often we don't. As you know, the census records frequently just list ages, genders. They never even list the names of the people who were enslaved sometimes. So what you see in the database is very simple. It is just the name of the congressman, the state he represented, his role in Congress, the years he was in Congress. That's really it. This is just tabulating the people who made the laws, how many of them were slaveholders and who were they?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have what's the database address so I can put it up here? I forgot the.
Oh, I will send it in the chat. One second.
Okay. Okay. Yeah,
And
that's awesome.
I'm really curious because, there was a lot of legislation done around slavery to codify it, strengthen it, say that slaves were 3/5 of a human being for voting purposes and whatnot. Is there a correlation between the men who are listed on the database and the slavery-related legislation that they either tried to get passed or did get passed?
Yes, this is something that I have done a little bit of writing about, but I'm really hoping that this database will be a tool for, oh, thank you, there it is. The database will be a tool for historians. If you're writing an article as a historian about one of these laws that was passed, now there's an easy tool to look up, how did the slaveholders vote? How did the non-slaveholders vote? And we've made the data available not just in this Washington Post database, but also on GitHub to make that analysis even easier. So I've started looking at a few laws, looking, for example, at the Missouri Compromise, which we think of as a compromise between slaveholders and non-slaveholders, but the vote was fairly unequally weighted. It wasn't as much of a compromise as we think when you look at how the slaveholders voted and how the non-slaveholders voted. So things like that I'm starting to research based on this database, and I think that's one of the best uses for having it.
Well, I know one potential reason why I would like to me personally dig into the database a bit more is to find out to see if there was a period when it was easier to pass anti-Black legislation, or whether that was just the same from then to today, or to find out if there was a period when it might have been easier for them to do it, but then there was a fulcrum and then it became harder for them to do it, like the Missouri Compromise. Again, not really openly taught about this aspect of American history, or at least not in my school. I knew the rough bare bones about the Missouri Compromise, which states were going to be brought into the Union as slave states, which ones weren't. But I don't really have an idea of just how contentious just that one compromise actually was.
Yeah, and when you talk about the times in which Congress, included people who were motivated to pass anti-Black legislation, I think it's really interesting to look at the time after the Civil War, not just the time in which there was slavery in this country and slave owners were making the laws. Look at all of the former slave owners who come back to Congress. During the Civil War, the number goes down. During Reconstruction, it's down. We start actually seeing Black congressmen, some of whom were formerly enslaved themselves, but very, very quickly, Southern states start sending people who had been slave owners to Congress, and that remains true all the way into the 1920s. So you think about who's making the laws, even though slavery's gone, the same people are making the laws.
Right.
So, when was...
Lacrissa Sims asks, are the slaves to congressmen documented to where they can be? I'm assuming that's supposed to say found, and how stuff is, but yeah, can they be, is it documented to where they can be found?
Yeah, that's a great question. So on the database, you'll see a little link for every single one of the 1,800 congressmen that just goes to his Congressional Bio Guide page, just so you can read his biography, which is often pretty useful in finding more information about him. There, for maybe 200 or so of the 1,800, there's another link that says read more. And those links, in most cases, will take you somewhere that you can find more information about the evidence that he was a slaveholder. So if you need any information on somebody and you don't see one of those read more links, email me and I'm happy to send you what I have. But the best links are the 200 or so guys with the read more.
So I am actually right now just shared the screen of the list of those that you're still looking for. And I'm looking at the link. This is awesome. It's done by every state in alphabetical order. And yeah, I'm heading to South Carolina. But this is an awesome link. And when you click on someone, this is the bio that she was talking about. So
yeah. So this is a real project for anybody who is able to dive in and help find some information on these remaining people.
Wow. Wow, this is awesome. This is crazy. So this guy was from Lawrence County, George Washington Shell. Okay.
Well, because again, we are living in very interesting times. I think that's the adjective I'm going to go with. Very contentious times. This database is kind of flying in the face against a goodly segment of the country who feels as though this information, this history, isn't necessary. It's divisive. I'm trying to think of some of the other kind of standard phrases that they like to throw out there. This was clearly a labor of love for you. And how do you see it fitting within the national conversation of stuff that's going on in Texas about what you can and can't say in a classroom, stuff that's going on in Florida about what you can and can't say in the classroom?
Yeah, one thing that has been great for me about the fact that we're having a real national conversation around how to teach kids about slavery and racism is that teachers are really thinking about this. They have this subject at the front of their minds because it's become controversial for them. So I've been invited to speak to a lot of classes because teachers are talking about this. So I've had some really great visits with students in schools in cities, in rural areas, one out of the country. It's been really great because students are asking a lot of questions. As soon as they hear on the news somebody doesn't necessarily want them to learn about something, they have questions about it.
Yeah, they go and learn. Yeah,
and I'm impressed by how much these students know. I've talked to students who certainly are better informed about this history than I was when I was their age.
Mm-hmm. And I guess I'm really curious. I mean, what would you say to the charge that, again, we've heard accusations about the Washington Post, that it's the fake news and the fake press. What would you say to the accusation, that this is just fake news?
Well, I would hope that anybody who takes the time to click those links I was talking about to look at the evidence sees that this is very much not fake, that this is all based on a lot of research. I think the most common criticism I heard was actually one I wasn't really expecting. I got a lot of emails saying, why'd you spend so much time on this? Don't we know this already? Isn't this obvious? Why are you still talking about this? And I think we don't. I think that there wasn't a list and now there is, and there's a lot you can learn from that list. But it's an interesting perspective that people think, oh, we already know all we need to know about this history.
Well, because Donnie and I get that too. We definitely get variations of that pushback. And I like to remind people, because again, I think there's a couple of things that I see going on. That slavery itself has been intellectualized, and when you intellectualize something and it becomes a concept, you lose the fact that these were real, living, breathing human beings. Mm-hmm. We're the children of that. We're the children of that. Mm-hmm. That's frustrating. Then the excuse, well, slavery happened way back when. Well, the horrors of slavery didn't stop after the Emancipation Proclamation. We may not have happened
way back when.
Yeah, exactly. But people conveniently forget.
The man whose grandfather was enslaved. That's not that long ago.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the thing is, Julie, I'm only 2 generations removed from it.
Mm-hmm.
Same here.
Only 2.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's it. So it really isn't that long ago. And when you were sent that message like that, that's something that most Black people go through all the
Mm-hmm.
time when they're doing their research. They're always told, why are you doing this? You're not enslaved. What is your issue? Why are you doing this? And I learned that the best way to stop that was what Brian said, which was to make them human. They don't look at those that were enslaved as human beings. But when you start making that comparison, that, well, don't you talk about your grandparents or great
Mm-hmm.
grandparents, and don't you share your great grandparents' story with your children? And they're like, well, yeah, of course I do. Well, that's what I'm doing. Mine's just happen to be enslaved.
Yeah.
Once you do that, once you make that kind of comparison between their family and your family, they're realizing, oh my God, we actually did this to people who
Yeah.
had children, who went on to, who carried on through this and still was able to produce law abiding citizens.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm fussing at them and I'm mad at them because they're talking about their own family.
Well,
So
I'm
once you
glad that
start
you're
making it,
yeah.
once you start talking about your family as your family and you point this out to them, and I say this to all of our viewers, don't get mad, just make them understand. Don't get mad, because we have to get to the point where we can deal with this and be able to go and discuss this on a rational level in order for us to get more of Americans to understand exactly what has been going on.
Mm.
They
And I
they
guess
they just they're not doing it.
my point is the bad things that happened to Black people in the United States of America did not end with slavery. Yep, we had Reconstruction, which lasted for about a heartbeat. Then we get into Jim Crow, where really
Mhm.
nasty stuff happened. And then we get into what we have now, what people refer to as Jim Crow 2.0, second iteration of it. So as much as people like to conveniently focus on slavery to say the horror show didn't stop in
Mhm.
1865, it still carries. And I just want to wrap up that thought with saying progress on paper, that means all of the amendments that were added to the Constitution, does not equal progress in the hearts and minds of the American people. We have descendants of enslavers who are in Congress today, stopping some of the most essential legislation that has yet to see the light of day on the floor. That's the Civil Rights Acts, that's the Voting Rights Acts, that's the Reparational Acts. There's a whole, the Criminal Justice Reform Acts, the Policing Reform Acts. The genesis of all of this goes back to the time period that your database covers.
Exactly. So I have another question for you, Julie, from Dr. Denise Marie Johnson Jackson. She says, I'm curious to know how many of the descendants of these slave owners are in the office of today. So, is there a way to, compare that?
Well, let me give a couple of different answers. I will say, first of all, I was, out of curiosity, somewhat looking out as I did this research for people whose descendants might still be in Congress. We know we have these families where people have been elected leaders for generations. I believe, in my sort of just perusing for it as I researched the old congressman, I found descendants who were in Congress as late as a few decades ago, but not right now. Second, if you're asking, are there current congressmen who are descended from, not from congressmen, but from slave owners? Almost certainly, just as we know that there are current congressmen descended from people who were enslaved. And third, I talked about one of those criticisms I got, which was, why are you spending so much time on this? Another really common criticism that I got was, why are you attacking people for what their ancestors did? And I think that says so much about the person writing that, because they're reading that into that. I never said anything about people's descendants in this article. To be fair, I am working on some upcoming articles that are about descendants, mostly descendants of people who were enslaved. But in this first article, what I wrote about was the historical congressmen and what they did. And yet people said, why are you attacking their descendants? Which, means that that's what they are thinking about. They see an attack on, and I don't think it's an attack, but they see a criticism of white congressmen in history, and they think it's a criticism of white congressmen now.
Where do you think that's a really interesting point too? And where do you think that's coming from?
Well, I think it's coming from part of where our political discussion is right now, where people are ready to jump to seeing things about identity. I think it's coming from some level of identification with history and feeling like these great patriotic leaders who we admire, we need to defend them. And there's, a lot of that, I think, in all of us Americans have some level of that, but you have to tread carefully.
Well, my thing is, as far as all of this is concerned, I'm gonna be honest, and I might actually make some of our virtual audience members upset. I'm not against certain statues. I'm not against statues because I feel like it's history. And there's absolutely nothing that you can change from the history of a statue being in a particular spot or a particular, I think there's a place for those things sometimes, but sometimes I think they're right where they're supposed to be, regardless. I also learned in looking at all, paying attention to all this and in my research, that a lot of people don't really understand when slavery was supposedly ended. So because they don't understand when it has ended, they immediately jump to defense for it. And they're not defense of it, but just defending themselves like, oh, I didn't have anything to do with that. That was a long time ago. And it's 1800. Yeah, it was in 1865 when the Emancipation was written. But we still had people going in through to slavery into the 60s. In the 1960s. I mean, there was an article just not long, about a year ago, that talked about a man that did not know he was free in 1960.
That was Vice. That was Vice News.
That was Vice News?
That was Vice News. But picking up on Donia's point, what would you say to someone who had the arguments, well, my ancestors didn't arrive to the United States until way after slavery, like late 1800s, early 1900s. What does any of this have to do with me?
Well, I mean, I'd be in that camp myself. I did not have any family here personally in the time that I've been researching. I'm a proud American, and this is American history, and I care a lot about my country's history, whether or not my personal ancestors were here to witness it.
That sounds good. Great answer. I mean, it is. It's a great answer. But overall, as far as slavery is concerned, what do you think it's going to take for Congress to actually just, approach this?
It's a good question. I think there's a lot of different directions that you could go with this information, and I don't know where people will take it. I think one thing I thought, because I originally came up with this idea because of the renaming discussion of should we change the names of elementary schools and public parks. And because that was how I came to the topic, I sort of expected that might be how this database would be used, that people would type in the name of their elementary school and find out that the guy on the building was a slaveholder and start discussing whether kids should go to school in a building with that name. I don't think that's happened much. And if you hear about it happening somewhere, let me know. I want to hear about it. I'd love to learn what's happening in your town. But I think that has not been a use of this. I think it has been used a lot by people who are researching their own family histories. That's probably been the most common use. I hope it will be used by historians. So, it can go a lot of different directions, and I'm interested to see where it does go.
Mm-hmm. And maybe, again, a project like this can be educational on so many different levels. You were talking about changing the names of buildings and places. I'm thinking just Washington, D.C. There are metro stops named
Mhm.
for enslavers. So maybe instead of trying to sweep all of that under the rug, if we actually acknowledge the buildings, the bridges, the places, the infrastructure that's named for enslavers, people can finally get a sense of just how pervasive it actually was, and to some extent still kind of is.
Yeah, absolutely. Since you're a DC neighbor, I would really encourage you to read. I've written a couple of articles about the DC place names, and I can't walk around the city anymore without noticing these things that I never knew before. Like we have a school campus named for one of the people on the wrong side of Brown v. Board, and he still has a school campus named for him. And once you know it, when you see Melvin Sharp's name on a school, you can't unsee it.
Then Lucressa Sims, she said, if the school is named after a slaveholder, then slavery should definitely be taught there. I totally agree with this. There was another comment that was done by a Sonia, and at the ending of it, she made she stated that she says, if you had an ancestor in America before the Civil War and you are poor, generationally uneducated, and socially immobile, you may be a descendant of an enslaved white person. White used to mean Anglo, and it excluded. And I can't understand what she said at the end. I I have to disagree with you. Um, I do not believe that there were white enslaved people, no more so that I do, and I know that they did not go through chattel slavery. There is a difference between the two, just like there is a difference between slavery and indentured servitude. If you are able to work yourself out of it, then that is not slavery. These people were not able to work themselves out of it. And these are the folks that we are discussing right now. Maybe later, if Brian and I find a show that can go into the differences between indentured servitude, slavery, chattel slavery, this may be the best place. That may be the best place to have like that type of conversation. So, thank you for giving us a possible show idea.
Yes.
Can I add another thank you?
Mhm.
I think it's probably not a coincidence that I just got an email right this moment from somebody saying that they've found another slaveholder I should add to my database. So thank you to the listener who likely just sent that. I'm excited to read what you sent.
That's great. So, how can they get in touch with you for that?
So I sent you the page with the list of all of the people I'm still researching, and that
Mhm.
page should have a link to a submission form where you can upload any documents you want to send, write anything you want to write, and send me any materials. And I read those very eagerly.
Okay.
And I'm curious, I mean, have you been or anyone in the team been approached by a descendant of a congressman that's in the database saying, well, kind of thank you for destroying my ancestor's legacy or tarnishing his name?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard from a lot of descendants of people in the database. I don't think any of them have said that. I think most of them have said, I'm really interested in my family history and I'm doing more research and here's what I know. And they've asked me questions about where I found what I found so it can help them on their research. But no, I don't think anybody has said, I don't want my ancestor's name listed there.
Okay. So you have not got the experience that Dong-It and I have had with our family trees. And
It's just recent that I have a high school friend who is doing research on her family, and it kind of really blew my mind that she actually says that her mother started to receive death threats.
Mm.
So because they were trying to find that overall connection from this line of that particular line she's in. So I want people to really understand how important this kind of database is to give us that, because it is always said that Black people cannot find their families, but this is how we find them.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't get mad at how we find them.
Mm-hmm.
You just have to understand that this is the move that we're making to get them done. We have to go. We always have to think outside of the box, look at the things that are not that easy. You know, you can go all the way back. Like when Julie was talking about the census records that she was looking at, the 1830 to 1840, those census records actually only list the person's name, the main person, the head of the household.
Mm-hmm.
And then afterwards, it tells you how many women, excuse me, let me rephrase that, how many white women, how many black women, how many freed people, how many enslaved people. It literally lists the numbers like that, and their names are still not listed.
Mm-hmm.
We're still not there. But because I know that Edward Settles was a guardian for Rebecca Bug, she's listed under those free people of color that are under her name, under his name in the 1840 census. And I know it because of my research. So these are the things that people really need to like pay attention to and understand that we're not coming for anyone's uh money. We're not coming for what it is that you own. We just want to know our family just like you know yours. So that's my rant, and I had to get that out.
Now, I guess the thing that I still grapple with and through all the research is, and again, Julie, talking about the time period that you're covering, is I still don't have an idea of the percentage of enslaving congressmen we're talking about. How much, I'm going to use the analogy of putting their thumb on the scale. How much does, were they in the minority in terms of people who were in the Congress? And if they were, like a constituent minority of congressmen, was the pressure that their thumb was putting on the scale of justice for enslaved people and Black Americans disproportionate to the relative numbers?
Well, first of all, it changes over time. They're a majority for the first 30 years. A majority of Congress are slave owners. After that, while they're a minority, they're a regional majority. There are southern states where they're a very large majority. If you look at Maryland and Virginia in the years all the way from the beginning of Congress up until the Civil War, more than 85% of Maryland and Virginia's congressmen are slave owners. And that's not representative of white people in Maryland and Virginia. That shows they're electing the people who are far more likely to be slave owners than anybody else in the state. So there was a political slant there.
So that really is kind of an American, I'm going to call it an American hangover of our governmental system. Because what you're describing, I'm kind of thinking what's happening now is we have a minority of political people who have a greatly outsized amount of power and pressure compared to the majority of what the American people believe. And it just seems as though this is still a carryover from the time period that we're talking about.
And then you start thinking about, well, if there were all these slave owners in Congress, what was their influence? What did they do? And I think it goes a lot farther than the laws that are very explicitly about slavery. I was reading recently the book American Republics, and he talks about the point in time where there's interest in expanding the country. And do they expand north into Canada? Do they expand into the Southwest, into land held by Mexico at the time? And a lot of the reason that the president at the time really decided, let's go after this Mexican land and try to make that part of the US, is pressure from Southern congressmen who were slave owners who wanted land where they could expand slavery, which they couldn't do in Canada. There's all these decisions that we look at the shape of the country we have now, and we don't think the country is shaped like this because of slavery. But behind the scenes, that was the motivating factor for so many choices they were making.
And actually, that's really interesting because hadn't Mexico already done away with slavery by that point?
Well, yes and no. In certain places, it continued. Slavery was not legal in Mexico, and in fact, that's part of why Texas ended up joining the U.S. was because they wanted legal slavery in Texas. But there were enslaved people in the places that are now the southwestern United States still.
Okay.
I'm working on a story about slavery in one particular state that I hope to publish in the next few months. It's not quite ready yet, but it gets really complicated in these places that go from Spain to Mexico to the US. The laws keep changing.
Cool. Just because I was thinking, well, it's kind of curious that America would want to expand either north or south if slavery wasn't being practiced in either one of those places. But then I remembered when the U.S. government took over Florida, Spain had a very different form of slavery. You could actually work your way out of it. And as soon as the United States got a hold of Florida, that was one of the first things to go.
Right. It's also just geographic. If they assume if we take over territory, we're going to bring in our language and our culture. And just the same way, we're going to bring in cotton, which, temperance-wise, you couldn't do that as well in Canada. That they were really just thinking, is this available land for my practices?
Wow.
And I'm going to say it is amazing. And I'm just going to say it to, detractors who are out there listening. Again, one of the accusations that Donnie and I have is that we receive is that we're picking over the scab of an old wound. Mm-hmm. And it's not because we hate our country. We want our country to be better. And we actually want our country to actually live up to the ideals that are stated in the Constitution, that we are all equal, that we all have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And until we get to that place, and we're not there, we need to do the work. And that, again, that's what makes the work that you're doing really, really important.
Yes, it is. That I do. And I don't know if you've ever seen this book, Julie.
No.
It
looks a lot like some of the things I've been looking at.
Well, you may want to go on ancestry.com because you can definitely either look at it there or it's on Family Search too, isn't it, Brian?
Mm-hmm. I believe it is.
Okay, so try to look this book up. This book actually has the slave owners, their names, the names of the slaves, everything. It's over 50. This is my Bible for where we research in South Carolina in Edgefield. And Edgefield is definitely a place that I don't know if you have everybody. I'm definitely going to look and see, but you may want to, try to check that out. If there's anybody in this book that may have enslaved people, they're listed.
Well, thank you so much.
Yes, it's called The Slave Records of Edgefield County, South Carolina. And I'll put that in the private chat for you.
I think I'm pretty close to completing the research on South Carolina, but there's still a few people left. So I really appreciate that too.
Well, as I said, the Brooks family is definitely represented in that book.
Mm-hmm. And in the database.
As a matter of fact, those records helped Donia figure out how she was a member of that family. Wow. So all of this information for researchers is just really important. Because and I appreciate that Donnie and I are always telling our audience, you have to look here, just all of these different places that people have to look. But that's what we have to do as genealogists, is called doing an exhaustive search. You have to think of everywhere your enslaved ancestor could be mentioned or listed.
Yeah, so I want to thank you so much for joining us. I'm sorry about everything that happened at the beginning, but it started to work fine. We just don't see you, but that's okay because you just gave us great information. And the name of the book, Dorcas, is Slave Records of Edgefield County, South Carolina. It is on. She asked this question, so I wanted to let her know.
Yeah, and it is digitized and it is searchable on ancestry.com, and we believe it's also on Family Search.
Right, and I don't know about any other county in South Carolina, and so I do apologize. But we just want to thank you again, Julie, for being on the show. We ask that you hold out, don't hang up just yet. And we want to tell you guys out there that thank you for watching us. Thank you for being up here. And we will come with another great show next week. This is our Celebrate Freedom series in honor of Juneteenth. So, continue to watch the show. Thank you so much.
Indeed. So until 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time next Sunday, this is Genealogy Adventures. I'm Brian Sheffy.
And I'm Donya Williams. And thank you again for being here.
Thank you
Bye,
both
guys.
so much.
Oh, thank you.
Yes. Please don't hang up.